Hare Krishna, everyone. This is the acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are taking a look at the 7th mantra of the Sri Isopanishad. This is the 8th video in my series. We began with an invocation mantra and are now 7 mantras into the text. I recommend starting at the beginning because we are building certain concepts upon one another as we go, and so be sure to start at part 1 if you haven't yet. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share a presentation on the screen for today. All right, let's go ahead and put it in full screen mode as well. So I've been sort of lovingly titling this series the Bhakti Upanishad because this text is very important. It's one of the central texts of Bhakti Yoga. I've also recommended that you pick up a copy of the Sri Isopanishad, which you can find on Amazon. You can also go to the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust or krishnastore.com. Those are some good places that I know you can get the book. And pick up the translation by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. That is the Bhakti monk who brought Bhakti Yoga to the United States in the 1960s. So the 7th mantra is what we're going to be looking at today. But just a quick reminder, the Upanishads are the ancient philosophical summaries and commentaries on the Vedas. So the Sri Isopanishad falls in this lineage of texts that are all divinely inspired and received commentaries or reflections upon the Vedas, which are also thought to be kind of like the mothership of spiritual wisdom in the yogic tradition. So this is this kind of stream of transcendental knowledge that comes through these sacred texts. The Sri Isopanishad is called the Upanishad of the Lord, and it was written in poetic verse. It consists of 18 verses. So here's mantra 7, which we'll read together if you want to read this out loud with me. One who always sees all living entities as spiritual sparks, in quality one with the Lord, becomes a true knower of things. What is there as illusion or anxiety for him? What a beautiful verse. Let's read it one more time. One who always sees all living entities as spiritual sparks, in quality one with the Lord, becomes a true knower of things. What is there as illusion or anxiety for him? So one of my favorite verses of the Sri Isopanishad, and as always, there's a number of different things that come out of this verse. It's beautiful, it's poetry, and yet it's very esoteric and deep. It's filled with very insightful information that for the practice of Bhakti Yoga is crucial. So let's take a look at one of the purports of this from this section that comes from Swami Prabhupada. He says, the Maha-Bhagavat, the great devotee, sees oneness in the sense that everything is the energy of the Supreme Lord. And as there is no difference between the energy and the energetic, there is the sense of oneness. Without heat and light, there is no meaning of fire. And yet, heat and light from the analytical point of view are different from fire. But in synthesis, heat, light, and fire are all the same one thing. So again, you'll notice how many times and how many different ways the Sri Isopanishad repeats this idea that we began with, this kind of philosophical idea called acyuta-bhava tattva, which is this idea that God is both many and one, both different and the same, that there's simultaneous and inconceivable oneness and difference or distinction. Is to say that we also have been building this idea that in Bhakti Yoga, we think of God as a person, as an actual being like you or me or a dog or a cat or a tree or a plant or a star or a planet, that God is a being. And that the goal of Bhakti Yoga is to link ourselves to that being in love and in service and in devotion, seeing ourselves as part of that being, but also recognizing that we each have our own free will and are also autonomous beings. And for this, we've said that love requires a choice. And this is why we have some sense of being autonomous with our own agency. Of course, we've also said that the highest use of our free will is to align ourselves with the whole of which we are a part. So this verse is building on the same idea in a sense. Let's go back up and read it again. One who always sees all living entities as spiritual sparks, meaning that we see them as, in one sense, one with God. We see them as energies of God. You, me, everything. That when we see other beings in this way, especially, that we become a true knower of things, because the real thing to know, it turns out, is that God is in everything and everyone and everywhere. And then when we know that, when we practice the art of knowing that, because it's not just a simple intellectual thing, it's something that we have to build a vision for in our hearts and in our souls, and it takes time to do so. And this is why we have practices in Bhakti Yoga, right? We'll get around to that again in a little bit. But when we do this and then we start to see God everywhere, that's when we actually start to see the truth, or that's when we start to see things as they are, or we start to come into true knowledge. And then when we come into true knowledge, the final question, sort of a rhetorical question, is what is there as illusion or anxiety for him? So when we see God everywhere, we can't be taken away by illusions. And we also can't fall into fear and anxiety, because where we see God, we see truth, we see beauty, and we're comforted. So when we see truth, beauty, we are comforted, and there can't be illusion or anxiety. And that all comes from building this practice of seeing God in everything and everyone. Not easy. Sounds nice, not easy to do. So, and then again, Srila Prabhupada's just sort of emphasizing for us that the great devotee, the great, let's say, bhakti yogi, sees oneness in the sense that they see God in everything and everyone. And yet, again, he drives home this conclusion that that does not mean that distinctions aren't real, that variegation and diversity isn't real. It doesn't mean that you, me, and all sorts of beings don't also have their own separate and autonomous agency. Just like heat and light are not the exact same as fire, and yet there is a sense in which heat, light, and fire all go together. So God is one, but God is also has this autonomy from all of God's energies, and we are thought to be one of God's energies, as is the whole universe. So really, really beautiful philosophy. This is the philosophy. It really took my heart, and why I got so interested in Bhakti Yoga. I could never personally get interested in the idea that all of this great diversity of energies and beings, and just so much diversity in the world, that it was all just an illusion, and that it should all be collapsed into sort of just one bright white light. To me, that didn't seem as spiritually appealing and beautiful and interesting as finding divine place and a sacred place for everything, our emotions, our relationships with each other, that they all have place in eternity. And so this is a verse that it's subtle, but it really delivers this, I mean, just amazingly beautiful vision, if you catch just a little glimpse of it, that of reality and of how we can learn to see one another. So bhakti removes illusion and anxiety. What that means is that focusing on a life that is dedicated to loving God, devoted to God, seeing God in all things, that it removes things that are false or untrue, and that when things that are untrue or false are removed, anxiety also goes with it. When we see God in everyone and everything, we see things clearly, and it reduces anxiety. Anxiety and fear come from choosing to see that which is other than God, and anything other than God is unreal and illusory, which means it produces fear. You'll actually find some similar statements made in a very famous text called A Course in Miracles. There are similar statements made in that text. They're not identical. The text is not an identical it's not necessarily like a bhakti yoga text per se, but there are some things in the Course in Miracles that remind me a little bit of bhakti yoga and vice versa. And this is one of them, that where we see anything other than God, we will naturally see fear, because we will see something that doesn't exist. And that which doesn't exist, as we've said, has a kind of reality to it. And that kind of reality is darkness, avidya, nescience, ignorance. And it's a kind of a real illusion. Just like if you walk into your basement and you see, that classic example, you see a garden hose coiled up and you think it's a snake. Well, you can have a reaction to it that's just as real as if you saw a snake, and you can fall right on your face trying to run away as quickly as you can, when in fact it wasn't a snake, it was just a garden hose. So similarly, when we see a world that's void of God, or we see we see anything devoid of God, we can't remember a way to relate what we're seeing and experiencing back to God. Then we're seeing an illusion, and that illusion, although it's unreal, can have a real effect. Just like in a dream, we could see a tiger is chasing us, and our heart can start pounding in our sleep. So similarly, in this world, when we see a world devoid of God, we can have a real reaction to it, and that reaction is generally painful. So that's the core philosophy, and that's underneath this verse is that same idea. Seeing God in everything takes practice, however. So in order to see God in everything, it's not just something that, it's a nice thought that comes up once in a while, that is only sentimental. We have to absorb ourselves in devotional actions in our life in order to begin awakening that vision. It begins with simple things like having a home altar, offering our food to God, chanting the names of God, singing to God, talking about God with friends, reading stories and scriptures about God, having sacred music in our home, being careful about who we associate with, being careful about what we take into our body. It's sort of like we start seeing our lives like it's an ashram, and how can I take care of this ashram so that I invite that God consciousness into my life, and I can start to see Krishna, I can start to see God everywhere. And it's a slow awakening process to begin seeing like that. And it happens because our heart really wants it, and we become determined, and then we take up practices, and we keep absorbing ourselves in the right transcendental vibration that starts to draw, some of my teachers would say, starts to draw God to us. God starts to say, oh, look at you. Because God is attracted to our attraction to God. That it becomes mutual and reciprocal in that sense. So anyway, we do have to absorb ourselves in practices. And if you haven't checked it out yet, remember to check out my 2 videos I've done so far on practices. Easy practices of surrender, mantra meditation for the first one. That's the most essential. Doing that every day is really important. And then the second video that I did is on sacred sound and how to put more sacred sound into your environment. Well, this is a good quote from the Bhagavad Gita, from the 12th chapter, my favorite chapter of the Gita. It says, one who is equal to friends and enemies, who is equipoised in honor and dishonor, heat and cold, happiness and distress, fame and infamy, who is always free from contaminating association, always silent and satisfied with anything, who doesn't care for any residence, who is fixed in knowledge, and who is engaged in devotional service. Such a person is very dear to me. So in this verse, one of the things that I like is it kind of just spells out some of the core, both the results of a life lived in devotion and also some of the practices. So for example, it's, this is a verse that says, hey, here's what you should practice if you want to attract the indwelling spirit of God, of divinity into your heart. Be equal to people, be equipoised, whether you're getting something good or receiving something difficult in life, whether it's hot or it's cold, you're really happy or you're stressed out, whether you're, you have fame and you're really loved, or you have infamy and people really despise you. Or if you're, and then there's also this kind of instruction here, like be careful of contaminating associations with people and environments, having silence in our lives, and also being satisfied with whatever's before us. These are all instructions for us, but they're also descriptions of what an elevated person looks like, that God is essentially like, I'm attracted to that. And again, in Bhakti, the whole point of Bhakti yoga is to be in, loving, intimate, personal connection with God. And so the way that the lifestyle that we live brings us into, each of us differently, a completely unique relationship with our source. So at any rate, but the core of this verse is telling us what to practice and how to be in order to also see God in everything and draw God closer to us. So this is one of my favorite verses. The Srimad-Bhagavatam also has a verse that I love that I thought was relevant for today's talk. It goes like this. This is from the 2nd canto, the 5th chapter, and the 17th verse. Inspired by him only, I discover what is already created by him, Narayana, under his vision as the all-pervading supersoul, and I also am created by him only. So this is a verse that's coming from, Lord Brahma, if I remember correctly, and Lord Brahma, and he's created the universe. But in the Srimad-Bhagavatam, as he creates the universe, he is also like in Hermeticism, which I've done a series on before, he's sort of like the demiurge. He has the facility to create the universe, but he's not God himself. So he's like a cosmic creator god that steps in to create this particular universe. And there's actually many Brahmas, many creator gods in many universes. So at any rate, after he's created the universe, he basically says, inspired by him alone, God, I discover what is already created by him under his vision as the all-pervading supersoul. This is a really interesting verse because have you ever had that experience where you create something, but like, let's say you write a book, at least I'm a writer, I did an MFA in creative writing and I wrote a book. And I had this experience, which Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of Eat, Pray, Love, also did a really nice talk on one time, which had to do with the muse. And I think you can probably relate. You create something, but it doesn't feel like you're creating it. It feels like you're discovering it. It feels like something's coming through you. And in this sense, the creator of the whole universe is actually saying, look, my inspiration came from God, and the creation of this universe is as though I just discovered what was already there by virtue of God's energy, by God's powers, by God's, beauty. So similarly, I've noticed that, as a creative person, whatever comes through me isn't necessarily something that's coming from me. It's something that's just there and already, and that I'm simply, becoming a conduit for it. And so similarly, sometimes when people say, hey, look, the point of bhakti yoga is to see God in everything. Some people will get a little bit stressed out by that, and they'll say, well, what about me? Or what about, what about my agency or something like that? Because it kind of sounds like what we're starting to do is we're starting to focus on God in everything. And in a sense, someone could start to feel like, well, where's my agency in this? Where's my role in all of this? But actually, each of us are also creators. It just so happens that whatever we create is, in a sense, already there. It's coming from God. And so this is one of my favorite verses because that's the experience that I have personally. Even though I'm a creative person, I consider myself in my best moments as only an instrument in the hands of God. Because anytime I create something, it feels as though I'm actually just discovering something that was already there, or I'm receiving something that's not really mine. And so this verse is also a way of saying, we're still creators. We're still co-creators in reality. It just so happens that as co-creators, what we're really learning to do is become instruments in the hands of our maker. And or you could think about it as we're becoming conduits for the divine creativity of forces and energies that are bigger than us, but that also want to flow through us and use us. And that's also really important when it comes to seeing God in everything. This is just my own, penny realization, I guess, is just that if I can look at the world around me and see it all as part of the creative outflowing of God, and that all of these different people that I meet or am surrounded by, the difficult ones, the easier ones, whatever, everything in between, if I can start seeing them as, instruments in the hands of God, that nothing that they're doing in a sense is really coming from them, and that we all are like this. It changes and it shifts things. And I find that in myself, at least, I'm able to become a slightly better instrument. I'm tuned a little bit better or something like that. I hope that wasn't too abstract. But anyway, I love this verse because it just reminds me that seeing God in everything means that we also see God's creativity flowing through everyone, and that we give credit. Each of us as co-creators, we keep giving credit back to God for flowing through us. So hopefully that was a fun one today. I look forward to getting into the next mantras with you. I also have a Q&A video coming up that I'll be doing because I've gotten some really good questions from all of you. I will do my best to answer them as far as I've understood and as far as my own teachers have taught me. And I'm also going to have some cool references for you this week with some new music, some new talks that you can listen to. So stay tuned for a new newsletter update coming up later in the week. Okay, take care, everyone. Hare Krishna.